A lot of us who are used to trying to solve problems, we see problems all the time, and sometimes we see ourselves as the problem. And that's okay. Dealing with a little bit of negativity or darkness, little neuroticism up and down, that's going to accompany a lot of us. If we go and do something positive about it, that's optimistic, it's hopeful.
At Mekanism, we build iconic brands with soul and science. The soul is culturally relevant brand building, and the science is the always-on marketing activities that drive the bottom line. Learn more at Mekanism.com. In today's episode of the Soul and Science Podcast, we're talking to Mark Pollard. He's a brand strategist, the CEO of Sweathead, the host of the Sweathead Podcast, and author of the book Strategy is Your Words. I've always loved that title of his book. For the past 20 years, Mark has worked with global brands like the Economist, Meta, the Wall Street Journal, among many others, to solve complex marketing challenges and build winning strategies. Throughout his career, he has blended non-traditional ideas, creativity, and analytical data that prove sometimes it's best to break the mold. In this episode, you'll learn why leveraging low-budget content and experimental ideas can be a winning part of your social media approach. You'll learn what types of non-traditional data and insights can be used to better inform your marketing strategy. And you'll learn how a diverse career path and expansive experiences can build a skill set that can solve even the most complex marketing challenges. All right, listeners, let's dive in and learn about the soul and science of strategy design. Tell me, Mark, you've got a strategy consultancy, right?
Yeah, I do more training now, but I sort of consult through the door of training.
Is it still Mighty Jungle?
I largely do things through Sweathead right now, which is like an online learning platform. So I've got like online courses, 4-week programs, events around the world. And when I work with companies, I try to structure it around training interactions, and it's largely through Sweathead more than Mighty Jungle.
What the name Sweathead means?
It all comes down to the thought that to get good at what we do in thinking and strategy world, but also in the creative world, you got to practice. I think a lot of people think that if they're lucky enough to go to college, they get out and they're amazing and they don't need to practice. And so if you're a thinker and you practice, it's like going to the gym, you're doing workouts, your head's going to sweat, hence Sweathead.
And tell me about how you got into strategy to begin with. Were you always in love with marketing and advertising and strategy, or how did you get into the strategy world?
No, I think there's a huge percentage of strategy people or account planners my age and older who sort of fell into it. So many people I know in the strategy world grew up around music or were just doing other stuff. Like I was publishing a hip hop magazine, but I was making websites, got a job helping to make websites, and then sort of was working at Tribal DDB 20 hours a week, making a magazine at the same computer late at night. And it wasn't until I was 28 that I got a full-time strategy job. And there weren't that many at the time. And that was at Leo Burnett in Sydney.
So how did you go from Hip Hop Magazine into strategy?
Well, the connection is always about content and the internet. So I was making like newsletters and then online websites from the age of, from the age of like 19 or so. And then I took over the main hip-hop radio show in Sydney when I was 20. So all your favorite rappers came through there. I spent like 3 hours with Flavor Flav when I was 20, interviewed Ice Cube.
Oh, that's so fun.
Mostly underground stuff, but interviewed a lot of the big people who sort of either came through physically or who released music and got a bit of local support, which was not very common at that point. And was also working in agencies doing a bit of production, but back then as a producer, we did a lot of stuff. So we would manage the clients, but also do user experience and information architecture. I really got into trying to understand things like SEO, just from a simple point of view. I was writing content. My first client in an agency was Levi's, helping them develop probably the first branded content thing in the Southern Hemisphere, where I'd interview all these musicians for them.
Oh, sick.
And so that was my world. I love the immediacy of how you could connect to people, build community, put content out into the world and not have to go through gatekeepers. And then when I was 28, the idea of strategy became a little bit more prominent. I don't even know how many strategists there were back then in Sydney. Maybe let's go with 50, not 100, surely. We're not talking about a lot of people. And then as I was a producer, had my first kid coming along, decided to go freelance because I was like, I don't know about this employee thing. And then I said to myself and to other people, the only job I'm taking is going to be a full-time strategy role, and got offered a couple and took a good one.
And then when did you go from full-time to kind of doing your own, work?
But early in mid-20s, I was like a quote unquote gig, not music gig guy, but I did put on gigs. I did put on events. So I was sort of, I had full-time jobs, but then I also had these jobs where I'd be like a Mac operator, or I would help build little websites while distributing music, publishing my magazine, writing for local street press. I had a weekly column I'd get like $30 for. And so most of my 20s was pretty patchwork, really. I didn't think about having a career. And then the recent full-time focus is we're eight years in now. That's been in New York. I've been in New York for 13 years. So eight years ago, I decided to go full-time.
And how do you create the Sweathead empire where you're doing, speaking gigs, then you're doing learning modules, then people can buy online, obviously they can buy your book, but they can buy online courses. How did you think about that and then set up that whole infrastructure?
Like one of the reasons that I decided to set up my first company in the US, Mighty Jungle, was I didn't want to be an employee and I didn't like corporate America. The style of strategy, the style of advertising idea that I liked, I couldn't come close to in the US, whether I was working with an old school agency in New York or a young agency in New York. You're still going to like a multinational company in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. And then I was going out to Silicon Valley and I'm like, oh, it's going to happen. And I was like, oh my God, this is so formal, conservative, and hierarchical at the time, to the point that I felt like people were kind of rude about hierarchy. And I was like, this is crazy, because back home we put out a lot of work and we're quite alpha. I'm sure you've worked with some Aussies. We're quite alpha and we like to compete. And I just found that the competition here was not about good thinking. It was not about creativity. It was about bureaucracy and status and hierarchy. And it was really conservative. Everyone had a story to tell. And I bought into a bunch of them. And I just got to the point where I was like, I can't do this. So I have to set up my own thing. So for the first 2 years of setting up my own thing, I was doing more consulting. I was lucky enough to work with the Economist, for example, La Colombe, all these cool little brands. That back then I'm charging 5 to 20 grand. I've got friends who are really good at charging 80 grand, 100 grand. I was doing like relatively small fee things. At least if you live in New York, they're small fee. And then about a year into that, a couple of things happened. Like I remember someone interviewed me for their own podcast. And I was like, I used to be the radio guy and I used to love that. And I only gave it up because I didn't make money and I had kids along and I bought into this other narrative about having to have a career, which I never wanted, never thought about seriously. And so probably within the space of a month, 6 years ago, I set up a Facebook group, which was, Facebook was still like a bigger thing than it is now, at least in the US and with younger people. And I set up a podcast and then kept doing the consultancy, eventually added some training events, largely with my friend Julian Cole, who's pretty big on the internet in the strategy world now. And then 2020 hit. I'd raised $37,000 for my book on Kickstarter. And as the pandemic hit, Julian and I had to cancel all of our events that year. We were talking about doing really deep collaborations, maybe even joining in a serious way. He ended up leaving the country. And I had to work out how to get a book out. And I also was like, how the hell am I going to feed my family? So on May 4, 2020, I launched the first of 100 classes. I still remember it because obviously May the 4th be with you. I had like 3,000 people sign up. And then ever since, it's just been every quarter, we're like, what are we going to do? Or what am I going to do? Gradually in the little team. So that's like the bumpy early days of it all.
How do you get critical mass to get people to sign up for your courses?
I've been blogging for a long time, so I had pretty good search and I'd slowly built up a newsletter, but I didn't take myself seriously enough. And I know that might be a funny thing to say. I didn't put any like signature on my social posts. I didn't have lead magnets in a serious way. If people read my articles, there was a little thing that you could sign up, put your email in. And then 2020 and beyond, I started to tighten up all of that. As far as critical mass, I don't know. I've had some luck. I've had months where maybe on Instagram I might reach organically million, 2 million people, then it'll drop back down to a few 100,000, and then the algorithm changes, so you don't know what's happening. Twitter, I had months where I was reaching 500,000 people, dead now. LinkedIn, same.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was good at the time, but at that time I didn't have a business model around it. Right. Whereas now I've got a business model, and the algorithms are a different game.
But you're also like never stopping creating content.
Yeah. One of the shifts that I've made in the past couple of years, and definitely this year, even though I've been quiet the past 6 weeks, is I asked myself, what would my life be like if I treated myself and my life as if I was a full-time content creator? And it's just it's a slight shift in mindset, but it means that you center content creation in your day. But what's really happening this year, and this is because the algorithms have really shifted in the past 12 months. It's a different game. Subscriber numbers and follower counts are lovely, but they don't matter that much because every day your content's competing with the best in your category, the best on the platform. So it's really, really different. And so, I've had 6 weeks of not publishing much online because I was in Cannes, did some talks, got COVID. And at the same time, we're selling a whole bunch of events over in Asia. And I was hoping for about 150 people in 5 events, and probably getting towards 500 to 600. It's partly from organic, but also just a little bit of luck with paid advertising, which I didn't do before. I didn't take myself seriously enough to do paid advertising. I was like, do I want to do paid advertising to people in advertising? That seems yuck. And so, slowly I'm becoming strategic.
Are you saying advertising works?
It does, but it's hard to advertise to strategists, and I don't always feel comfortable about doing it. Even asking for an email address when we've spent hours creating something that I think is a very useful deck, it feels a bit odd, and sometimes I'll see little comments online about people like me and other people who do that sort of stuff, or who dare to charge for training. And so I'm aware of that energy. I kind of feel when I was younger, I would have been a bit more cynical towards it. But now, I think the headline for me is advertising has never been more advertising, just the way that the platforms are going, what we're learning from the marketing sciences. And so there's something liberating about that, actually.
Tell me about your book, Strategy is Your Words. What inspired you to write that book?
So I'd thought for about a decade that I wanted to write a book about our work, and I've been blogging about it. Probably, I can't even remember when I started, maybe 2006 or 2008. And I would often do how to do account planning, or how to and why kind of articles. And a couple of them went mini viral for our industry. One of them, how to do account planning, I think it's had in various shapes well over 150,000 reads in 16, 17 years or something. Oh no, maybe 14 years. And before I left Sydney, I submitted a proposal to Kickstarter when it was a little bit different. It was more about creative projects. They loosened it up a few years later, and they said my project wasn't creative enough, which I totally get. And then a few years later, when was this? I started writing it about 6 years ago, I think maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And I knew that I wanted to write my training material into a book. I delivered it verbally, but not sat down and written it out. So I knew that was going to be part of it. And I knew I was going to write about strategy, and I have to use the word strategy or no one pays attention to me. I just remember sitting there with the first page open going, what are we going to call this thing? And I thought, well, you have to use the word strategy. You just have to. And we're going to talk about words. And I was like, that's so obvious. I had this argument with myself. Well, if it's so obvious, why do you keep talking about it? So I wrote strategy, I wrote words, and I was like, let me just put something a little bit weird and off center in the middle. So strategy is your words. So half of it's training, my training material, how to do strategy largely in the context of advertising, but also you could apply it to anything that requires a bit of critical thinking. And then the first half is taking words that strategists have talked to me a lot about and just trying to think them through, like partly philosophically, psychologically. So thoughts like lone wolf, imposter syndrome, clarity, confusion. It's a bit absurdist. It's not for everyone, but one of my favorite pieces of feedback is when someone says it's the first time I've ever seen myself in a book.
That must feel good. So do you find that today, years later, that the book is just as relevant? Another way to say that is, do you think strategy has significantly changed in the past couple of years?
I mean, it seems like it's a mess out there, largely speaking. I'd say the two, maybe the two or three forces that come to mind spontaneously are one, obviously, the role of artificial intelligence. So a lot of companies are wondering if they need strategists or if they need more expensive strategists. Can't we just, have a junior staff, maybe one senior person, get some tools happening and see what happens? So that's definitely a force. On the other side, I think there's better understanding of the marketing sciences. A lot of the research by the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, Binet and Field, and so on and so forth. Less known in the US, I think, overall. Really well known in the UK and Australia. I think there's just a lot of amazing stuff that's out there. System One Group share a lot of research as well. And then I think we sort of had this weird culture going on where programmatic, data-driven this, data-driven that, logical business thinkers, the product marketer, that more concrete thinker took over. And it's not that they weren't in control before, but they took over in a way where I feel, and I've seen it up close, they kind of shat on people who weren't like them. Do you have a statistic to prove that that idea could work? It's like, what? Do you have a statistic to prove that that joke or that song could work? What are you talking about?
I still think at the end of the day, a great insight and great strategy is the only way you can make great work. So it has to start there. So while there's a lot of noise, the fundamentals are always the same. Can you share a pivotal moment in your career that maybe changed or augmented the way you think about strategy?
I'd say the time I spent at Leo Burnett in Sydney. I had a boss, Todd Sampson, who's super famous there. He's got multiple television shows now. We had a team of maybe 10 planners or so. Really good people. Some are running agencies like M&C Saatchi, Justin Graham. Others are heads of strategy. A couple have left. They all were and are amazing people, amazing thinkers. And I think two things really have stuck with me from that time there. So I was probably from the age of 28 to 30. We won so many awards in that place. And so being in a place that was really good at what it did and had high expectations, that everyone expected to go to Cannes, and you can criticize that, but everyone expected to go to Cannes every year. And if they didn't, they were kind of upset. Being in a place where there are high expectations and people who can meet those expectations is really freaking rare. And I didn't know that. It took me moving countries where I was like, you could work in a big agency in New York that doesn't do good work, but you won't know. And you might get even gaslit into thinking it's your fault or that it's just normal. And there is amazing work in the US, of course, but overall, it's like relative to the capacity and the money and the brain power here, I don't know.
There's 14,900 agencies in the US. So there's no way they're all pumping out good work.
No, by definition, 10% of anything's any good, right?
Yeah, of course. So like that narrows it down right there.
Yeah. So that was one thing I took out of it. And then also he really, my boss, Todd, really exposed us to thinkers like Edward de Bono, looking at critical thinking tools. Edward de Bono is he's passed away, he's a very famous author looking at creativity, but especially creativity in business, written tens and tens of books. And in the UK especially, and Australia, I think a lot of the things he came up with are embedded in the business culture where people might not even know. I don't know how big he was in the US, but he was on national television shows in other countries. And so even if you've ever been in a meeting and people are talking about ideas and someone will say, oh, I'm going to put my black hat on or white hat, yellow hat, that's Edward de Bono. He really pushed the notion of linear and lateral thinking, which changed my life. So I'd say like Leo Burnett Sydney was pretty pivotal.
How do you think about strategy when you're balancing insights, finding insights through data-driven decision-making, but then also what I learned from your posts, a lot of it is like the person writing the strategy, their personal viewpoint and their creativity and their gut versus it's coming from some data or statistic or, number. How do you kind of balance that when you think about strategy, the head versus the heart?
It's all of those things. It's not one of those things. Marketing academics would laugh to hear us talk about something coming from the gut, except there's also a lot of stuff written about how some of the biggest scientific breakthroughs came from the gut. So
you could find data to back up that it's stuff comes from the gut, not data.
Yeah, like it's just, like I've seen one of the most famous marketing academics make fun of someone talking about instinct as a medieval idea. And I'm like, that's just a weird thing to dunk on someone for. Like, what are you even talking about? My point is, you need evidence, you need information. The challenge is when people use the word data based on the way that I understand it, that they're not using the word in a correct way. There's this pyramid, the data, information, knowledge, wisdom, DIKW pyramid. Data in that situation is essentially like, it's not nothing, but it's kind of nothing. When it gets used, it's information. So data could be the number 2. It could be a statistic, 67%. It could be the word blue. But most people who talk about a data-driven insight, what they're actually saying is, do you have a statistic to prove that this will work in the future? And so until we understand the way that people are using words at each other, these conversations are very, very confusing. And most people who ask that kind of question don't even know what they're asking about, have probably never had an insight, are probably not even interested in people. They just know that they've got this one little question that they can mess with people. But yeah, I think you need your evidence, you need your statistics, and then I'm looking for a lateral leap, But having said that, I like to talk about hair, open to a hair conversation. One of the quotes that I still remember from interviews about hair, which I do talk about a lot, I need to get some new material. A guy once said to me, "I don't feel accomplished enough to be bald." Now, am I going to take that exact sentence and put it into a creative brief? I don't know. But I hadn't heard it like that before. It's bringing two topics together.
It's a pretty great line.
Yeah, and it hits you in the gut. It hits you in the gut, right? Now, could I run a poll with 5 similar sentences to see what people would agree with? Yeah, I'd be manufacturing the data there. But this is sort of that sentence is the kind of truth that I'm looking for in the work that we do.
When we think about data, you're kind of leaning into a little bit of testing if it will be successful or not, like imagining if it'll work. But there's also, you could come up with a concept and then go find supporting numbers to back it up, right? Like, and support it. And
Sure.
that's one way to go. Or you could find, I don't know, look through a company's annual report and find something interesting numbers wise from their data that they're serving up and pull out an insight, right? Like, what's your methodology if you're starting from a blank sheet of paper?
Yeah, well, let me get into that in a second as well. But you could also dig into some academic papers like behavioral economics. There's something I came across. I get nervous about talking about sociological research because it often gets debunked, or it's done on college students for $1 or something, right? But I found this thing a while ago which said that couples who argue about how much to donate tend to donate more. That's an insight. And maybe the way that I'd originally seen it, there was a statistic like X% of couples who argue about how much to donate tend to donate more. That could be an insight. I don't know what you're doing as a brand or as a charity with that. You want to get people to argue, right? But you can also dig into it. Well, what's causing that? They're invested, and then one of them wants to win. So then you can talk about, competition in relationships. The way that I was working in agencies is, I was pretty good at time boxing my time, and I had a lot of go-to techniques. So these days, I definitely want to be speaking to people. I'd often interview 10 to 50 people on a project. Usually big companies have come to me when I'm independent working in that way, and they're like, we've got 5 agencies, we've got an in-house team, we've got decks all over the place with the word strategy on them. We don't know what we've got. We don't think we've got a strategy. So I'll often come in and just try to help clarify it all. That's definitely one use case for me. And I don't say that in an arrogant way. I know how difficult it is to do this kind of work. And then, I will go through Google Scholar, or I'll try to find academic research. I used to find keyword research, search behavior, more useful than it is now. Google Trends was kind of useful back then. It's sort of just like a bit of a gimmick these days, I think. Big fan of just trawling through hashtags, looking for comments, trawling through consumer reviews in a qualitative way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to put all that stuff into a word cloud. Word clouds are mostly ridiculous. But I'm looking journalistically for combinations of words based on, what are the pain points people are facing? What are their needs? How did they make this purchase? There's certain other questions that are sitting above this. But I'm largely looking for language. It's a combination of all of that. At some point, some quant will definitely come in. That was never my strong suit. I think my strong suit was looking for unusual language or listening for unusual language.
What's one unconventional source of inspiration you teach people or train people on to look for strategic insights from?
Yeah, like for me, anything is material. I do refer a lot to stand-up comedy. Every now and then I'll refer people to fiction, because good fiction, every paragraph will have a psychological insight. This really dawned on me. So one of the good things about New York is, especially a few years ago, good bookstores, Strand Book Arcade or Strand Bookstores, or whatever. Strand Book Arcade, amazing, right? And I just picked up this George Eliot book. I'd not read her much or at all, actually, growing up. And it was called Silas Marner. It's a classic. Everyone in the UK would know it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this person's so psychologically insightful. It's from a very long time ago. So it's stand-up comedy and fiction. But then one of the ways that I mess with the kids is I'm really into like reggaeton and dembo and Brazil funk. And I'm into like for my age and my gringo look, relatively unusual culture as well. And so I'll try to bring that stuff into a lot of my interactions as well, because I want people to connect to really alive things in the world, where what I believe a lot of strategists do in their first years, they try to mimic formal strategists and they just become dull and boring. And especially in the US, you can become really careerist at a very young age. And I'm more into the strategist with a bit of edge. And so if I'm teaching somebody for half a day or they're doing like a 4-week course, I try to like get them to connect back to, if they ever had it, get them to connect back to the things that they like that were a little bit on the edges.
And that's a source of inspiration from their past, or...
Yeah. I'll give you 2 quick examples. So, and I was working with a person who was a drag performer, and their CV, their portfolio, their work, it didn't have the life that I'd seen on the internet from this person. So we talked about that. And obviously they were nervous that if they brought that energy into their work, it could cost them opportunity. And I know, as like a heterosexual, increasingly middle-aged white dude who plays too much Clash Royale, that it's easy for me to say, oh, just be more of yourself. That not everyone can afford that. I get that. But that's an example. And then one of my students, and I'm sure you wouldn't mind me talking about this either, was a guy called Raka from Dilated Peoples, a really big rap group. And, he's a rapper. He's around words all the time. And yet when he wrote strategy with me, I could tell he was trying to be a little heightened. And I'm like, dude, like, keep it in the genre you're in. There's nothing wrong with it. Because when we start to heighten our language, we become more vague. It's confused. Like, what are we talking about here? And so that's one of my favorite things, just to help people connect back to the things in their lives, especially if they were verbal things in their lives, like they used to read a lot or write a lot, or they were a rapper or a poet. I want to get them back there, because then I think they can be more useful to other people.
Do you have optimism about the state of our industry?
I think that's a really tough question. I have a lot of optimism for the creative, strategic minds in the industry. I think a lot of them are going to struggle for a few years until some new way of living comes to life. I know a lot of people who've been around for a while, they're not charging what they used to charge. They're struggling to get jobs and keep jobs. And yeah, we all know somebody who's crushing it right now, but I don't believe that's the majority.
No, I don't think so either. I think it's a really tough time.
I think it's really tough. And I get around the world, and whether it's in Berlin or Prague or even in New York or LA, even talking to freelancers in their 30s and 40s, the past year, what I've heard that I have never heard before is that this is the most difficult part of a lot of freelancers' careers. Why does that matter? A lot of people in their 30s and 40s are going to be freelancers. And I can't remember where I read this, but there's a point of view out there saying that you might need 3 kinds of gigs, like 3 kinds of things you can sell. So maybe strategy is one of them.
Do you have a mantra or quote that you think about all the time?
Well, I mean, my book starts with one, which is "From mess comes what's next." It's not that I think about that phrase all the time, but when I wrote my book, I was in my maybe late 30s, wasn't sure what I wanted to do in life. Had my head down, working my ass off, doing a hip hop magazine, working in advertising, putting on music events, moving to New York, doing long hours, traveling. I was like, I don't know if I like a lot of this, but I don't know what I do like outside of it either, which a lot of people go through. And also, I always felt that I was a little bit broken. So from Mess Comes What's Next is just a way for me to talk optimistically about myself. And when I do talk to groups about that phrase, it's really to say that, like, a lot of us who are used to trying to solve problems, we see problems all the time, and sometimes we see ourselves as the problem. And that's okay, because if we go and do something positive about it, that's optimistic, it's hopeful, and dealing with a little bit of negativity or darkness, little neuroticism up and down, that's going to accompany a lot of us in this kind of career with these sorts of personality traits. So that's really where that comes from.
What's something that's inspired you lately?
I'm really inspired by Latin America right now. So I'm studying Spanish. I'm infatuated with a few Brazil funk producers. There's a couple of people in reggaeton and dembo that I love, and it just brings me to life. And I also like Afro beats, but I have an order of music that I go through depending on the time of day, or whether it's leg day. Leg day is Brazil funk or dembo, and I discovered it late in life, but I love it.
I love that. What is a new tactic that you want our audience to try? Give them an insight that they can do that they're not doing.
I mean, the two that come to mind are using some DM automation tools such as ManyChat, so creating lead magnets, encouraging people to chat with you through comments and DMs on Instagram and other platforms. I think that's quite interesting for various reasons. And then also trying some more lo-fi video production for TikTok and Instagram. It's tough if you're a brand. My most viewed Instagram reel, I think it's at about 1.7 million now. It took me 10 seconds to film. I'm sitting next to someone who's doing therapy in public on their phone. You can just hear them. You don't know what they're saying. And anyway, that thing went crazy.
What did you say about it?
I just had like one of those POV texts. So POV, something like me sitting next to somebody in public doing therapy on their phone, and then a little twist, while blaming her husband for her cheating. That's it. Now, I don't have a business model around my amazing Instagram reels like that, or my sort of what I call my comedy reels, dad jokes, but you just got to kind of create a whole bunch of stuff to see what sticks.
And then you see what sticks. Yeah, I love that. So
Yeah.
Go out there and create more. What's your take on Rachel Gunn?
Oh man, Australia had Australia had the first full color hip hop magazine. I think my boy Blaze created Vapors, which was the first full color hip hop magazine. I created the first full color hip hop magazine.
You talk so much about hip hop, and breaking was in the Olympics. I had to ask about her.
Yeah, so I don't actually talk that much about hip hop in general. Like, Australian graffiti was really, really good back in the day. Breakdancing was really, really good. I mean, she's a PhD. She studied it. I saw somebody quoting her in her defense saying that Australia had like a nascent, as in a young breakdancing scene. I'm like, that's incorrect. So I don't know where that came from. 2024. I mean, hip hop's been there since the early 80s, mid 80s, in a very boisterous way. To watch it didn't fill me with pride.
Well, I mean, some people are defending her and saying, well, she did her own style. But
yeah, look, sometimes it's just like, was that good? It wasn't good, but keep doing your thing. I don't usually try to get into criticism of people, but it was slightly offensive, considering I know that so many people from that scene who are my age and older, they didn't have access to anything. They were probably breakdancing on cardboard. They probably didn't even have a breakdancing mat, probably didn't have decent shoes. And then this is like one of the first big international moments for it. And so I don't know. Good honor, as we say, but also that wasn't good.
That wasn't good, no. All right. Mark Pollard, he's successful enough to be bald, but he isn't. He has gorgeous hair.
Turkey, mate. Turkey hairlines.
He has gorgeous hair now from Turkey, and it looks great. And thanks for being on the podcast, especially before your, fourth world tour this year.
It's going to be good. I'll see you in person at some point, no doubt.
I'd love to get together. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jason. Peace.
Soul and Science is a Mekanism podcast produced by Maggie Bowles, Ryan Tillotson, and Lily Jablonski. The show is edited by Daniel Ferreira with theme music by Kyle Merritt. And I'm your host, Jason Harris.